Quin, I want to turn to the question of timescales now and going forward. So if we could have your second witness statement on screen, WITN 7526002, please, Lawrence. And if we could go to the third page, paragraph 8. So you say in paragraph 8, having enhanced my understanding of the issue in November 2022, I was keen to set a challenging internal deadline to complete consideration of the Sir Robert Francis Study's recommendations by May 2023. And then you refer to the letter you sent to the Chancellor, which we looked at before the break. Now, that's the internal deadline. You told Parliament on the 15th of December, and again, we looked at it before the break, so I'm not proposing to put it on screen again, that you couldn't commit to a timetable. And as I understand it from the statement you made to Parliament, part of the reason for that may have been not wanting to commit to a timetable unless you were confident you could deliver it. Is that right?
Absolutely right.
But although you didn't commit to a timetable in public, you did internally have the deadline that you've referred to in your statement. Would it have been, do you think, looking at it now, of some assistance to make that internal deadline public for two reasons? The first, it might well provide important encouragement for officials, especially if matters have been proceeding slowly up to that point. And secondly, it might remove a small measure of uncertainty for those infected and affected, to have at least some understanding of what timetable the government was trying to work to.
To your first point, officials and my ministerial colleagues were in no doubt that of my desire and the government's desire to make progress. So, and they were, as you say, that was a letter to the Home Affairs Committee of the Cabinet. For internal purposes, that was setting a challenging deadline. I recognise it would be a challenging deadline, but sometimes you need to set challenging deadlines in government to get momentum. And so that was an internal target. I was very conscious in setting that deadline that a lot of work needed to be done, and I had not at that stage had a small ministerial group going through with colleagues as to what would be achievable. So as the coordinator, as the chair of that SMG, saying this is what we should be working to was an appropriate thing to do, but without agreeing that with ministerial colleagues and having a collective agreement to be giving assurance to Parliament and indeed to the community that that is a deadline I would be hitting would be a rash thing to do.
Do you see that from the perspective of those most intimately concerned with this matter, those infected, those affected, that if they don't have any information about deadlines or likely timescales, from their perspective, first of all they're seeing is what may seem to them to be inertia or apathy. And secondly, they have themselves, it has the potential to increase their sense of hopelessness.
I recognise that. It is incredibly, I recognise how much hurt has gone on for so long, and that with Sir Robert's study and with this inquiry, there is a real sense that finally we're getting to a conclusion. And that is also my view, that finally we're getting to a conclusion. So the fact that there's the moral case for compensation, it's incredibly helpful to have the second interim report out. This all helps us to develop the government's conclusions. But I'm really worried about, given the history, to say, don't you worry, by the end of May we will have be able to announce substantive progress on the following issues, and then not to hit that deadline is something I was acutely aware not to do. I do not want to give people a false expectation. I want to give people an expectation that I could not meet. And at that stage, I was not in a position to know that we would be able to hit a May deadline. And indeed, we weren't.
So the May deadline has passed, and we are now some 8 months or so on from your letter to the Chancellor in early December. Are you able to tell us now what timescale the government is working to?
The objective remains to be able to respond as swiftly as possible after the final report. And I heard Sir Brian yesterday. I understand the final report will be in autumn. And our objective as a government is to ensure that we can respond swiftly, as swiftly as possible after the final report.
I want to come on to, in a moment, the question of waiting for the final report. Would you accept this, that it would be wrong for this matter not to have reached some form of conclusion in terms of a government announcement of its response on compensation before the end of this year? So wrong if it were to shift into next year, not least because there is the possibility of a general election next year with all the attendant uncertainties as to when and all the attendant constraints created by election purdah.
I'm really keen to get an announcement as soon as possible. And the one thing I may add, if it's helpful, because it goes back to the letter to the Chancellor, is a desire to try and show, as I've discussed, some of the building blocks towards a substantive response. That remained a focus throughout, but to ensure above all that we're in a position to come up with a substantive response as soon as possible after the final report. I really, really do want to have that as soon as possible, and that is a view that is shared, I know, across government.
As soon as possible is quite a loose frame, because Mr. Ellis used that very phrase in July 2022, and we're 12 months on. And I'm sure you'd agree that 12 months is not as soon as possible. Are you able to be any more precise than that?
The response from the government will be a full government response, a cross-government agreement. So I'm not empowered to be able to set a deadline for the government to respond. I'm not in a position to do that today. It would be wrong for me to pretend that I could come to this inquiry and say, I've got cross-government agreement for a response by this date. That's not the position I'm in. And so I can only tell you that the government is committed to responding as soon as they can after the final report. And as I've said consistently, if there are things we're able to say before the final report, that would be great, but a substantive report after the final report, as a substantial response after the final report. I can't give a date because I'm not in a position, I'm not empowered to do that.
In your first statement, as at 21st of November, you said at that point in time, no decisions had been made and no options had been presented to you for consideration. 8-9 months further on, and again, I stress I'm not asking you for the details of the options that are under consideration, or maybe under consideration, in terms of the specifics, but has the decision-making reached a stage at which there are now options that are being considered at a ministerial level?
Yes, I think I can give you that assurance that there is that because of the work that has been done, there is far greater clarity on the issues, and is now in a position where some significant decisions need to be made, but I'm far more confident that we have the building blocks that are required for those decisions to be made in government.
Can we just look at the Chair's second interim report. It's INQY. Sorry, I feel I should know this number off by heart. 0000453. And I just want to go to the very last page, please, Lawrence. So as you'll know, Mr. Quin, the report has at the end all of the Chair's recommendations set out. Most of the recommendations are what I could call recommendations of substance, so what the scheme should look like, what the kind of awards should be made, and so on. Recommendation 18, the last recommendation, is a recommendation of timing. Set up now and should begin work this year. If the government is proposing to wait until after the final report is received before making a decision or announcing a decision, is it right to understand that the government is effectively rejecting recommendation 18?
I can't think of any of the recommendations that we've gone through and taken a decision as a government to reject. But there are practical consequences which come to bear. One of them, as I've referred in the House of Commons, I did refer to a number of the issues with which we're contending. One of them is the strong likelihood of the requirement for primary legislation to establish the compensation scheme. And that, as the Leader of the House referred to yesterday, would take time. As the Leader of the House said yesterday, the decisions on legislation tend to be made prior to and announced as part of the King's speech, and then there is some time following that to put legislation in place. So that is one constraint in terms of timing.
Can I come then to this question of waiting until the inquiry's final report is available? Why is that the government's position? What is it that you think when I say you, I mean the government, Mr. Quin, I should say, that you will learn that's so essential to the decision making, that it's worth deferring any announcement on the compensation scheme until then?
My understanding is that it's entirely a matter of the inquiry. My understanding is that the final report is likely to come out in the autumn. Is my understanding. There is absolutely no reason why the government should hold back on taking as many decisions as it can and being in a position to respond very swiftly after the final report is announced. And that is the process that we're doing. I'm afraid I've lost my train of thought. Would you mind repeating the question?
Of course. What is it about the final report that means that you are waiting for it? What do you expect to learn from the final report that's relevant to the decision to establish a compensation scheme and the form that it takes?
Thank you for repeating the question. I'm sorry I had to ask for it to be repeated. There is an awful lot we know. And so my decision on behalf of the government, so the government's decision which I had which I announced about the moral case of compensation, that came out of everything we've heard from these inquiries and the work of Sir Robert's study as well. So it is clear that there is, in our view, there is a moral case for compensation. It is clear that we are doing work to produce that case for compensation. It is likely that a lot of the recommendations in the inquiry's second interim report they're quite novel in some respects, and they also will involve, although no decisions have been taken as yet, a substantial amount of taxpayers' funds, unsurprisingly, given the appalling history of this scandal. Being able to put the government's response into the context of those findings is a useful and helpful thing to do in justifying our actions and setting out why we've undertaken the steps that we have and explaining how any compensation scheme that is brought forward is put in the context of other recommendations and other actions of the government in response to the overall final report on this scandal.
That sounds as though, Mr. Quin, that following receipt of the inquiry's final report, if you're going to be looking also at not just all the findings, and there'll no doubt be quite a lot of those, but also any other recommendations that the chair makes, wholly unrelated to compensation. If you're going to do all that before you make an announcement on a compensation scheme, that's months, isn't it?
No, I wouldn't wish that to be read into my answer. Although again, no decision's been taken on government as to how we'd respond to the report we haven't received, I would not see any reason why the government should say we cannot respond to the compensation elements prior to responding to other findings in respect of the inquiry. So I'm not putting a blocker on the government responding to the compensation elements prior to us having a substantive response to other elements of the findings. And I would, if I may, also say that it is incredibly useful to have had the second interim report when it came out. So it really is useful that we've had that. This is where the inquiry's ended on compensation. That's the final word on compensation. What do we do to ensure that we are in the best possible place? So it is incredibly useful to have had that second interim report early.
Can I just explore this issue of waiting to the final report a little further with you? In May, I think it was May of 2021, the then Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, said on oath to this inquiry that if the inquiry recommends compensation, it will be paid. December 2022, the government having made the interim payments that were recommended in the autumn, you accepted on behalf of the government the moral case for compensation. The chair's second interim report says in terms, wrongs were done at individual, collective and systemic levels. And you yourself on the 22nd of June, and you've referred to this in your evidence already, said that you were certain that the full report would put those proposals into further and these were your words, I fear in many ways deeply upsetting context. So pulling all those together, the government's not expecting the final report, I think, to be happy reading. Is that right? From the government's perspective?
I think it will unveil very, very significant issues that happened over many decades and should never, ever have happened.
But given everything else, given the acceptance of the moral case, given Mr. Hancock's acceptance of the principle of compensation if recommended, why wait until receipt of the final report when you have already the final word on compensation from this inquiry?
In practical terms, there is still work to be done and decisions to be made. So I would not wish the inquiry to think that everything is ready and we're just sitting waiting for the final report. That would not be a conclusion I wish you to take. So there is work to be done for us to be ready for the final report. So that is one just very real practical issue. There is advantage in being able to set out in response to, as part of our response, in part of the compensation scheme, any compensation scheme that is brought forward, they put that in the context of the final report and all the losses that have taken place over that period.
I appreciate you can't make policy or make decisions in the witness box, Mr. Quin, so let me put this, before I leave this particular topic list to you in this way. Can I invite you to take back to your colleagues for conscious consideration and conscientious consideration the question of uncoupling what the government does in response to the Sir Robert Francis study and the interim report from this inquiry, uncoupling that from the final report. I invite you to have further discussions within government with your colleagues about whether that's really necessary or appropriate, given the very particular history of this matter.
Absolutely made the point, and I commit to discussing that again with my colleagues.
And then can I just put to you, sorry, I said I was leaving this topic, just one further matter to explore. What I want to put to you, Mr. Quin, is two concerns that have been expressed by many of those who are infected or affected about why the government has said it won't make its decision, its announcement until the final report. So I'm going to put them to you and then invite you to comment to the extent that you feel able to do so. Some fear that it's being used as an excuse because there has been delay to date, because the government hasn't acted as quickly as it should have done. Others fear that the decision to wait for the final report is because at that point the inquiry ceases to have any powers and the government would be free to disregard the inquiry's recommendations with impunity. Now, those are very real concerns amongst some who would stand potentially to be the beneficiaries of a compensation scheme. Are you able to say anything about those matters?
In my dealings across government, I've seen no suggestion that any of my colleagues want to come to a conclusion other than bringing forward a full response to the work of the inquiry and making certain that we set out our response. And as I say, no decisions have been made, but all the arguments in favour of a compensation scheme, and you've quoted, in particular, my reference to the moral case having been made, and to what others have said in the past, that still stands.
Can I then move to a couple of other topics and then just come back with some final, more general questions? Meetings with the devolved administrations. You've given us the dates in your statement. I think there were 2 meetings in the last couple of months. And they resulted in the publication of a joint communique. Perhaps we'll just put that up on screen. RLIT 302157, please, Lawrence. So we can see here this joint communique, 12th of June. Second bullet point tells us this is the first occasion that ministers and the Northern Ireland Permanent Secretary have met to discuss the report. Do you know whether there had been any ministerial meetings prior to that to discuss Sir Robert Francis's report across the devolved administrations?
I'm not aware of any.
And then there's reference to the moral case, proposal that there's going to be a further meeting in the coming weeks. Has that happened?
Yes.
Are there further meetings planned? Again, I'm not asking for dates or details of discussions.
We certainly concluded the last meeting saying that we would meet again, absolutely.
Again, I ask this in quite broad terms. What's the purpose of the meeting with the devolved administrations in general terms? I know health is a devolved matter. Is the question of compensation regarded as a devolved matter?
It is an issue on which the devolved administrations would certainly have a view and wish to express a view. Both the study and the inquiry's report make a firm recommendation that these are matters that took place before devolution, and therefore, as I think I've said in the past, the UK government has a unique responsibility in terms of these matters, and those are the kinds of issues that would have been discussed in that context with the devolved administration. It was also a rare example where there was a difference between the two between the study and the second interim report about how compensation payments could be made.
Costs estimates. In your third witness statement, so perhaps, again, let's just have a quick look at that. Lawrence, WITN 7526004. Oh, no, that's wrong. Sorry, my fault. I'm afraid I don't have a reference for it. 005. Thank you. If we look at paragraph 16, please. I think that's probably page 5. Thank you. So you say there, my understanding is that there's considerable uncertainty over the size of the cohort who might be eligible for an award. And then you refer to the inquirer's statistical expert group and the figures that have been summarised arising out of those, the expert group's statistical work. And you've got there then estimates of numbers of people infected in bleeding disorders and numbers of people infected through transfusion. And obviously those are significant numbers of individuals identified as part of the statistical exercise. Would you accept, however, that the actual likely numbers of claims, so the likely numbers that would fall within a cohort who would benefit from a compensation scheme, are certain to be substantially lower than that? And that your best guide may be to look at the numbers registered with the current schemes and the numbers who applied for and received interim payments last autumn?
My understanding from the recommendations is that compensation could go further than those that are registered within the existing schemes.
You're absolutely right in general terms, Mr. Quin. And of course, for financial modelling purposes, no doubt a government wishes to look at theoretical possibilities in terms of numbers. But thousands of those who have been infected will have died. There will be many who were infected who probably never knew they were infected and are not going to be coming forward now to make a claim. In relation to hepatitis C and those infected through transfusion, which is where the higher numbers appear, there was a fund established in 2004, the Skipton Fund, open since 2011 to the estates of those who died before 2003. So people have been able to make claims for having been infected through transfusion for nearly 2 decades. And then people did make claims, both as living infected people and bereaved partners, for interim payments in the autumn of last year. And the actual figures, and I know you've been provided with a note which pulls together the most recent figures that we've received from the devolved schemes, but rather than put it up, the actual numbers of infected people registered now across the UK is 3,484. And there were 3,503 interim payments made. So it's important, isn't it, that whatever decision the government finally makes is made on the basis of a realistic understanding of the likely numbers and not theoretical statistical possibilities.
I would certainly agree with that. The government's modelling would have to take into account, in theory, how large a claim could be made, because of course you need to do that in government, but would also look at a range of probabilities and the most likely outcome.
And do you know, and it may be that this is a question for Ms Dunn or others, but do you know what kind of numbers of claims the government's decision-making is based on at the moment? And I'm sorry, that was slightly clumsily expressed. Has that work been done so that the government now has what it considers a realistic understanding of the actual likely numbers of claims?
Work has been done to try and establish both the maximum and also within that the most probable outcome.
Can we then just look at a couple of articles of recent origin? So the first is RLIT 0002137. This is an article in the Financial Times, and you will see in the left-hand column, it's asserted that the compensation bill could reach £10 billion, according to officials, in a further blow to the UK's stretched public finances. Ministers have accepted the moral case for compensating families. Scandal dates back to the 70s and 80s. Ministers are only now coming to terms with the financial hit. Government officials have told the Financial Times that the compensation scheme might cost £5 billion to £10 billion. And then there's reference to talks being held and an official saying people are very worried about the cost. Were the government officials who were briefing this newspaper, do you know whether they were Cabinet Office officials or Treasury officials? Has there been any inquiry as to why officials were apparently leaking this information to the press?
I do not know which government officials spoke to that particular journalist and gave him that information.
There's a later article, again, I'll just put...
If I may, and I'm not... and that's not to confirm the information in the article either. I mean, there's a reason why government doesn't comment on these things, and I would not have been at all happy to see that kind of information being put into the public domain in any way, or the source of it.
There's a later article, I think that I'll take time putting it up on screen, but for the benefit of those behind me, it's RLIT 302136. That's I think, a Telegraph article, and in that one, the estimate that's being reported is doubled or quadrupled to 20 billion. First of all, would you agree it's not helpful for those infected and affected to learn this kind of information through the press? It's not the right way. I'm sorry.
I completely agree.
A cynical construction could be placed upon it to say, well, this is the government leaking information about the likely high cost at a time of cost of living crisis because it wants to reduce the prospect for public criticism in the coming months if what it announces is something less than people hope it will. Now that's a cynical construction to place on it, that this is a deliberate exercise of officials, I'm not suggesting of you, Mr. Quin, a deliberate exercise of officials to try and get it out there that this is all going to be too expensive for the government. Is there anything that you feel able to comment on in response to that?
No, I was very frustrated to see speculation of that nature being put into the public domain. It is speculation, and it is not helpful.
You'll know, Mr. Quin, that one of the interim report's recommendations was to make interim payments to a cohort of individuals who have never received any form of compensation, who don't benefit from the current and have never benefited from the predecessor financial support schemes, but who suffered the most horrific losses. So parents whose children died and children whose parents died. The recommendation goes a little wider than that, but I'm just going to focus on those two cohorts, and it's, I think, recommendation 12 in the interim report. Now, given that you're not yet able to commit to a timescale for the final announcement, and that you've told us that there is still some work to be done, and that no decisions as yet have been taken on the actual shape and content of the scheme. Would you agree all that strengthens further the case for active consideration of making making interim payments for the first time to those cohorts of individuals?
So we have looked at the recommendation on interim payments alongside the other recommendations in the second interim report, and would wish to make a statement on any interim payment at the same time that we respond to the rest of the report, which is not to say that there is a rejection of the concept of a interim payment, far from it, but to come up with a combined response both on interim and on the rest of the report.
Do we understand from that that as things stand at today's date, the government is not anticipating making any decision or announcement on interim payments for those groups that I've identified until after the final report?
To date, what we've said publicly is that we are looking at that recommendation alongside the other recommendations. No final decision has been made as to whether an interim payment could be made prior to other recommendations being concluded, although there is a lot of work to be done to conclude our views on the compensation scheme, and the compensation scheme that we brought forward, which may indeed have a bearing on interim payments that will be made.
Has any work been done on at least in anticipation of the possibility of such interim payments, of starting the process of registering people now, without seeking to raise expectation, but so that at least if you do make the decision to make those payments, the payments can then be made swiftly? Because, as you'll know, the rationale for the Chair's first interim report and for the limitation of the payments to those, effectively those currently registered with the schemes, was that that could be done quickly because they were already registered. If you don't even make a decision on the other interim payments until you make the rest of your decisions, and you then say you will make those payments, it would be months then further wasted, would it not? Could you not at least start the process of registration now? Or has any work been done to see how feasible that is?
Okay, the worry on this incredibly valid point that registration would be required and would be needed for the second interim payment as recommended by the inquiry. There is a significant nervousness about registering people before a decision has actually been taken that they will be receiving that interim payment. So that would be, as you will appreciate, something which, in terms of a decision, yes, that interim payment will be made, and then inviting people to register. It would be, whilst I'd say no decision has been made at all, to have established a registration scheme before definitely determining across government that that payment would be made would seem a difficult step to take.
I'm going to now just put to you a couple of general points, and the points I explored again with Miss Mordaunt yesterday. As I'm sure you'll know, Miss Mordaunt in Parliament in, I think, May of this year, used the words about putting it right. And she said, it may fall to us in this place on our shift to put that right, but we must put it right. We have to put it right. Would you accept that if the acknowledgement of the moral case for compensation is not followed by action in paying compensation, that you're not putting it right, and that the acceptance of the moral case becomes nothing more than a hollow statement?
Penny spoke yesterday evenly about her own personal commitment to this. You can't be heavily involved as the sponsor minister without getting emotion involved and wanting to get a conclusion. And I'm exactly the same place as Penny in wanting to see this concluded. There is a process within government which you understand and the inquiry understands, whereby decisions are taken collectively. But when I said what I did on behalf of the government about the moral case, that absolutely says what it says, that there is a moral case here for compensation to be paid. And the discussions in government are very much focused. Well, no decisions have been taken. The discussions are very much around that compensation scheme.
I understand that no decisions have been taken on a number of matters as to how a scheme would be established and what its scope would be and so on. I'm hoping that you can confirm, at least given everything you've said in Parliament, and indeed given the express recognition by the government that last year's interim payments were the beginning and not the end. It is the government's position, isn't it, that there will be a compensation scheme. It just isn't able to say anything about its detail or its scope.
We've not said anything about the detail or the scope, but we absolutely did say that the interim payments were the beginning and not the end of this matter.
And that means there will be a compensation scheme?
I've got no doubt. I've got no doubt that compensation will be paid. The form and shape of that compensation are decisions that have to be made.
Last point, and again, it's one I explored with Ms Morden, but I put it to her on a hypothetical basis because she's no longer the minister primarily concerned. Many of those infected and affected are concerned that the government, in full knowledge that people are dying, and you yourself have made that point in Parliament, Mr Quin, are kicking the question of compensation off into the long grass. Now, I asked Ms Morden for her views as to whether that, if that were the case, hypothetically, if there were that conscious dragging of feet on the basis it's too complicated or too expensive, whether that would be a morally objectionable, a morally repugnant course of action. I want to ask you the non-hypothetical question. Can you confirm, Mr Quin, that the government is not dragging its feet on the basis it's too expensive or too complicated, and that it's not kicking it off into the long grass?
I've not seen any evidence that there is a view in government to kick this into the long grass. There is a determination to get this resolved. We want to get this resolved, and we want to get redress for those who have suffered so much. Absolutely the case.
And has there been any assessment by the government, for its own purposes, of the number of further lives that might be lost before the government responds?
I don't think we need further analysis. I think we all know about the ongoing toll, and I'm very aware of it, and I'm aware of the number of people who are dying.
So those are the questions I was proposing to ask. Just over my 40-minute estimate, sorry. We obviously need to take a break now for the final opportunity for call participants to suggest questions. So I was wondering, and I appreciate it involves detaining Mr Quin beyond 1 o'clock, but if we could perhaps take half an hour now, I think that would be sufficient for questions.
Well, it really, I think, depends on you, Mr Quin. The one possibility would be for everyone to take a lunch break now, which would be about an hour and a quarter, and then they'd come back for however long it would be. I can't, I'm afraid, tell you how long, because it depends how many questions there are for you arising out of what you've said in your statements and this morning. When that's done, then you are finished. But it depends really on your own timetable. I'm conscious that you are a busy man amongst other things with this, but also with other things. Would you prefer a break of half an hour to field the questions, come back, answer them, and then everyone have their lunch after that? or would you prefer to have the break now, which would use our time a bit more productively?
Sir Brian, it's very kind of you to place the question with me. My preference would be to have the half-hour break and come back, but I'm entirely in the hands of the
Well,
inquiry.
let's do that. We'll have a half an hour break. If any further time is needed, you'll be told. Sometimes the number of questions come in a little late, or in some number. So we'll take a half-hour break. We will come back then at 1:05, unless there's further notice.